Welcome to the Freedom to Learn podcast. I'm your host, Ginny Gentles. This season, we're diving into what it means to return education to states, communities, and families. And we're exploring what becomes possible when education is freed from union dominance and federal control. Sarah Parshall Perry joins the podcast today to discuss the legal, cultural, and policy battles shaping American education. We cover the mission of Defending Education's new Center for Litigation and Legal Policy. We talk about the outsized influence of accrediting bodies like the American Bar Association. We cover teachers' unions, political spending, and activism, as well as gender secrecy plans and the ongoing battle for parental rights in education. We added a new rapid-fire component to today's episode, so please let us know what you think. Sarah Perry is Vice President and Legal Fellow at Defending Education and a former Senior Counsel at the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. She's also the Chair of the Federalist Society's Education Law Executive Committee. Sarah Parshall Perry, welcome to Freedom to Learn.
Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
You're one of the most energetic, dedicated, and determined people I've had the pleasure to work with in recent years, and it is a crowded field. What drew you to our particular public policy arena?
You know, I think, Ginny, it's probably your exact same skin in the game, right? Once you have kids, your perspective on the value of American public education completely changes. For many people, and I think the majority of American parents, public school is a necessity for their kids. And once I realized that I was having to walk this path with my children, and I was really sort of radicalized during the COVID era. In fact, I was serving at the U.S. Department of Education as one of the senior attorneys at the Civil Rights Office at the time. And it was surreal because I was working for the government, sitting at my kitchen table because the entire government had gone home to basically telework while I was also overseeing the online schooling of three of my children. And it was absolutely unbelievable. But I'm in this because I believe public education should work and should be high quality for every American school kid. That's a promise that every kid deserves.
Well, Defending Education is launching a Center for Litigation and Legal Policy. What's the center's mission?
So ultimately, we want to bring greater transparency and greater enforcement efforts to what we're seeing right now as the violation of civil rights and constitutional law in American education. One of the things we feel very strongly about is the First Amendment, that every student does not shed their First Amendment rights at the schoolhouse gate. And that is still true in higher education, the same way it is for K through 12. And in fact, once we see these campuses institute things like, for example, bias response teams, what we did was initially launch a lawsuit against Missouri State University because they had an anonymous reporting system where students who could report other students if they felt as though their particular protected class was somehow disadvantaged or discriminated against, but it didn't rise to the level of discrimination under Title IX of the Education Amendments. They could basically anonymously narc on their fellow students, and those students could be dragged in front of a disciplinary council and actually be, quote, re-educated. That's the kind of stuff that we're looking forward to litigating more in the future. Our goal is to ultimately develop our own in-house litigation shop. I'm going to be expanding with the hiring of another legal associate and a law clerk to basically direct our efforts through enforcement that does not work through just dispatches, just public records requests, just sort of publicity and media exposure. Sometimes it takes federal litigation, and that's exactly what the center is going to be all about.
Well, Defending Education has certainly been very effective at doing all of those other things. So very excited to hear and see and follow the developments as you all expand the work and the lawsuits. All right, you all recently issued a report exposing the role of the American Bar Association when it comes to accreditation of law schools. And that seems a few steps removed from your typical work. Connect the dots for us. Explain why this was an important issue to tackle.
What we've realized is that a lot of these specialized education schools, whether it's medical school or the schools of social sciences or the schools of education or the law schools, have their own sort of subset of problems when it comes to the indoctrination and ideology that's being pushed from the accrediting associations. So what we've done is we've taken sort of a bird's eye view of all of the accrediting associations that are recognized by the U.S. Department of Education. And since 1958, the American Bar Association has been the sole accreditor for American law schools. That means they act as a gatekeeper for Title IV funding purposes for 196 plus law schools in the United States. And that also trickles down to professional licensing, because in just about every state in the country, with a few exceptions now as people are starting to wake up to the ABA's nonsense, you have to sit for the bar, but only if you have graduated from an ABA-approved law school. That means that they're not only gatekeeping on education, they're gatekeeping on professional licensing. And one of the problems with the ABA is that they've instituted some model standards that are de facto mandates for American law schools. One of those is Standard 303C, and that requires 6 credits of what are called experiential learning classes in cross-cultural competency, bias, and racial sensitivity. Now, I like to joke that yesterday's lawyers are smarter than today's lawyers because we didn't have to sit through 6 credits of racial sensitivity training, but now that is a mandate at least 62 American law schools that we've been able to discover, with 72 American law schools still operating, well, loudly and proudly, I might add, DEI offices, despite the Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard ruling, despite federal directives from the Department of Education, and despite longstanding civil rights proclamations on not using race in higher education. Unfortunately, the problem's not going away anytime soon, and the 62 schools that we know are in fact using Standard 303, requiring 6 credits of racial sensitivity training, are just those that we discovered in front of a paywall. That doesn't count for any of the other classes that are being hidden behind student logins or behind university paywalls.
Right. And so if they're taking those classes, then they're not taking substantive legal classes, right?
That's exactly it. They're not taking taxes or torts or contract or constitutional law. Where you take from one area, you are necessarily giving to another area. And this is where I think we are always struggling to make sure that quality of education is our number one priority, whether that's in K through 12 or in higher education. And the more you infuse indoctrination, you eliminate the opportunity for actual education. That is substantive classroom time that's not being dedicated to the actual finite practice of specialized law. I don't care what your field is. It could be patent law or constitutional law, civil rights litigation, or corporate mergers and acquisitions. That's 6 credits that's being dedicated elsewhere, and that makes ultimately for less capable attorneys.
Some folks might not understand what we're talking about when we're talking about Title IV accreditation. I'll say, I, as a K-12 policy person, did not use those terms regularly. Can you just, you said gatekeeper when you were talking about accreditation. Can you explain a little bit more about what the significance of that is?
Sure. So the Department of Education has the sole authority to approve individual accrediting agencies. And these accrediting agencies are those that give sort of their thumbs up, their imprimatur of approval on any particular institution as representing a quality education. I'll give you an example with the ABA. Not only do they require 6 credits of racial sensitivity training, which is totally useless, but they also require, for example, a certain number of law school books to be in the law library. They need a certain number of professional, full-time, tenure-track professors to be teaching, as opposed to adjuncts or part-time professors to be teaching. Some of these criteria don't have any direct bearing on whether or not someone is achieving a quality legal education. But as the only imprimatur of approval, the only association that can give a thumbs up or thumbs down, that accreditation serves as the gateway to get federal funding. When the ABA says this law school is good, the Department of Education can release Title IV funding, higher education funds that can go to institutions that have passed essentially a quality check. But if the ABA does not approve, what they do is they imperil the opportunity to get federal funding from the U.S. Department of Education. And that, as we know, is a significant amount of money from all of the law schools across the country. So again, all of the accrediting associations, for example, the American Medical Association, that accrediting association, or the Southeastern Colleges Accrediting Association, that geographic accreditor. All of these operate as kind of the levers of power on how much access to how much federal funding a particular institution can get. That gives them a lot of outsized power.
You've written about this in the National Review. I've been listening to you talk about this issue. It seems like you have some recommendations that could be implemented at the federal level. And as we talk about those, two of my colleagues at the Defense of Freedom Institute are part of NASIKI. So tell us what you're hoping to see at the federal level, what you're hoping to see from NASIKI.
Yeah, the NASIKI review of a lot of these professional associations is up in summer this year in July. And what we're hoping is that the same sort of dog and pony show that all these accrediting agencies roll out is really going to be scrutinized for what it is. Is this a sufficient sort of indicia of how quality a legal education is, a medical education is, a social work education is? Or are these accrediting associations using their bully pulpits to indoctrinate and infuse their particular political perspective through the accrediting process? Our hope is that all of the members of the NASIKI board, when they come together to review, will just take a very close look at something that has been, for a generation, largely rubber stamped. The accrediting process has never sort of garnered the attention that it's getting this year, but we see that as a hopeful sign that ultimately there is an opportunity for reform. And what we also hope is that the Department of Education will remove barriers to recognizing new accreditors, that these accreditors can actually come to the market, that there won't be such 2, 3, 4-year hurdles before they can actually be recognized. And that, as we know, competition drives excellence, right? That's not just in the private enterprise sector, but also in the public education sector as well. Let's add additional accreditors so that we have other voices in the room about what a sufficient education and higher education spaces looks like.
Well, we spend a lot of time at the Freedom to Learn podcast talking about returning education to the states and elevating, highlighting what states are doing. Tell us what you've seen out of Florida and Texas on this front.
Yeah, Florida and Texas have actually really been the vanguard of this movement, because what they realize is the judiciary in each state, these are the judges who are sitting at the highest state, these are generally the Supreme Courts in every state, have the opportunity to actually determine what is required to sit for the bar. Will they require graduation from an ABA-approved law school, or will they require essentially graduation from any law school, regardless of whether or not it has ABA approval? So Texas and Florida have taken it upon themselves to revisit these particular processes and say, in our state, we're going to accept graduation, not just from an ABA-approved law school, but also from a non-ABA-approved law school or from a non-traditional legal education route through, for example, an apprenticeship program, something that California has been recognizing for years. California does a lot of things wrong. This is something it actually does right. It was one of the first states to say there were alternative paths to be able to sit for the bar. You didn't just need to graduate from an ABA-approved law school. The minute we divest the ABA of its power, we recognize that the state judiciaries actually have an opportunity to make the difference on who can become an attorney in their state. We know that there are burgeoning efforts underway in Tennessee and Ohio as well, and we're very excited to see what they do.
Well, Sarah, in that National Review piece, you referred to the American Bar Association as a progressive advocacy organization masquerading as a neutral membership organization. And that just reminded me of all these medical associations that we've encountered in the gender ideology space. Yeah. This seems like an issue that's much broader than just the ABA.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, once again, we recognize that professional associations, the minute that they're overtaken by political ideology and bad science and bad philosophy and bad law, you recognize exactly how significant the trickle-down effect is. Listen, the gender identity war has taken on multiple different manifestations, not just in education, but in medicine and in healthcare. I mean, we saw, obviously, from essentially the Obama administration forward, when they were making very glib pronunciations about opening bathrooms up back in 2015 14 to anyone who identified as a particular sex based on their gender identity, regardless of what their underlying biological sex was, with a Dear Colleague letter written under Catherine Lehman's signature. We saw that perpetuated and expanded under the Biden administration. And when that happened, of course, it was working in concert with HHS and Dr. Rachel Levine, the man in a dress. I don't say that lightly. That's exactly what he is, regardless of how he identifies, as the helm of essentially the HHS, which is essentially pushing out propaganda, for lack of a better term, on the necessity of so-called gender-affirming care, something that now our own NIH and the Cass report and longitudinal data from all across the world, including the Western developed nations who have all backed off from earlier aggressive stances on gender medicine. We recognize that when the American Psychiatric Association or the American Academy of Pediatrics or the American Medical Association refuse to essentially back off of gender ideology, that trickle-down effect into medicine and even into education, as we see that partnership between education and medicine in what we see, for example, in community schools or community-based health centers. Education and medicine very often go hand in hand, and both professional associations have a real stake in advancing gender identity, which indicates to me, and you know this full well, Jenny, we are not anywhere near the end of the road on fighting for sanity in gender identity.
Oh, I'm sure you have the same reaction I do when you see declarations of victory on social media. We won.
Yes.
Oh no.
I wish someone would tell me that. Yes, that's exactly it.
Yeah, I'll see a celebration of an executive order signing as if that's the end. No, that's a wonderful acknowledgement of the problem, and it's a beginning of the solution. There are so many steps and so many miles left to go. Defending education, like Defense of Freedom Institute, has been fighting the gender ideology and other ideologies in education. I'd like to go through quickly a few of the products and the efforts that you all have taken to expose what's happening in schools and who's behind it. So on the topic of gender ideology, gender support plans, there was a recent exposure of what's going on in Vermont, but you all have covered the gender support plans and their implementation in school districts across the country. Tell us what those are and what you all have done.
We have maintained a catalog for 5 years of schools across the country that are maintaining these so-called gender secrecy policies. And this is where students are being given gender support plans and they're being socially transitioned behind their parents' backs without their parents' knowledge, approval, or consent. To say that this is a violation of a long-standing constitutional right is to understate the problem. I was disappointed because the Supreme Court had an opportunity to take a case precisely on this issue. Yeah. It decided it was not going to take this case on the merits. It did give us a really good decision, as I'm sure you've talked about on this podcast, Jenny, in the Mirabelli versus Olson decision, with Justice Barrett writing specifically over the past few weeks that this was a fundamental interference with the parental right, worse than what we saw in Mahmoud versus Taylor. But this is something that we've seen recently in Vermont to a degree that's largely unprecedented in any other state aside from California. Based on the actual population of Vermont itself, we've seen 200 schools. That represents over 50,000 students in the state of Vermont who are under gender support plan policies and gender secrecy plans where their parents are being explicitly cut out of the equation, that the best practices that these teachers and administrators and school principals are instituting actually prevent disclosure of this information to custodial parents. This is something that is so anathema to what we understand about the biological, long-standing, pre-political, natural right of the parent-child relationship that we didn't think we'd have to ask the Supreme Court to weigh in. But here we are. We're still having to ask the Supreme Court to weigh in. And this is only one state out of multitudes of states that we've surveyed across the country. Now we are up to over 1,200 school districts, and that's 12.5 million children in public schools in the U.S. who are subject to school policies that hide gender identity information from parents. That is a scandal of national proportions. And if we're not paying attention to it, we do so to our detriment.
And these parent exclusion policies sometimes aren't put in writing, they're just in practice, and parents discover them the hard way when their
Yes.
child is hurt and a wedge has been driven between the parent and the child by these school districts' pernicious policies. Fortunately, the US Department of Education is taking action and showing a no tolerance approach towards those. We're going to need to see a lot more happen. Okay, teachers' unions, a topic that we address a lot here at Freedom to Learn. Defending Education recently exposed that the NEA, the AFT, is a political machine. Let's just be honest about what these are. Again, do not masquerade as a professional association or even as a labor association. These entities are political machines. Tell us what you all found.
We had two reports. One, we just looked from 2015 onward at the two national AFT and NEA led by Randy Weingarten and Becky Pringle. And I can dunk on the NEA and the AFT all day long. We recognize that they've done nothing to enhance public education. And so their missives about really being for the children and wanting to change for the children and pushing democracy for the children are just sound and fury, signifying nothing, to quote Shakespeare, and not well. I will tell you that distinctly we found $669 million spent on left-wing Democratic causes from the AFT and the NEA at the national level. But at the state and local chapter level, over $339 million, bringing the entire total from 2015, that's in a period of just over 10 years, to $1 billion on hard left political causes. I am talking Act Blue, Democracy Forward, Media Matters for America, Human Rights Campaign, NARAL, Planned Parenthood, the Democratic Senate PAC. These are educational opportunities that are being squandered on hard left political causes. Every single union due that is paid in by a teacher who believes that they're getting better pay, better benefits, better compensation, better time off, better working conditions is going instead to fund the pet projects of the leadership in the AFT and the NEA. And again, you show me what you spend your money on, and I will show you what you value. NEA and the AFT have indicated to America now, thanks to these public records requests and the tax disclosures that we went through meticulously, we've recognized now what we always suspected, which is that they don't care about education. They only care about activation and only for a progressive cause.
Well, and let's acknowledge where those teachers' union dues are coming from. They're originally coming from the taxpayers who are paying the teachers' salaries, and then a portion of those salaries, funded by the taxpayers, are then going to the unions, and then the unions are investing in these political groups.
Bingo.
So even if you don't have a kid in K-12 education, you're a taxpayer.
That's it. And you're subsidizing hard left political causes. Yeah. That's exactly it, whether or not you want to.
Okay. May Day 2026 toolkit. What's going on there?
You know, May Day, very interesting opportunity for the teachers essentially to push their own flavor of the week when it comes to activism. This is motivated by what we saw as the protests against ICE enforcement efforts in Minneapolis, and it has expanded all across the country. Now, both of the teachers' unions, the NEA and the AFT, have developed these toolkits to basically teach teachers how to turn their students into little mini Marxist agitprops by protesting, by walking out. They have called for no work. They've called for no school. They've called to a shutdown of the national economy, specifically because this happens to be what the AFT and the NEA want as basically their hallmark on sort of the punchline of ICE enforcement efforts in Minneapolis. It is culminating in this so-called day of action, and they've developed tools to be able to get kids to walk out of classrooms, to tell teachers that they shouldn't be marking students truant or absent, that they shouldn't be punished for being truant. I've got to tell you, my hope as not only an attorney, but as a mother, is that these school principals do enforce fairly, because you can't do so unfairly. You can't unduly punish a student for participating in a protest on classroom time, but you can enforce equally. If these students are out of class, you do mark them absent, you do mark them truant. That is exactly what they should do under longstanding federal and constitutional law.
Well, and you certainly are keeping an eye on these student walkouts and protests. There's a tracker that people can find on the website to see how, unfortunately, increasingly common this is becoming.
And what we've seen, Jenny, is that in increasing measure, there is a correlation between students who are not present for classroom instruction and the correlated NAEP scores, right? The National Assessment of Education Progress. We know we're at 22% numeracy and 35% literacy for high school seniors in 2024, which is the last cohort that was judged completely through the COVID pandemic. That was an abysmal score refutation. And what we've seen now is that now with increasing calls for activism, now increasing measures for truancy, walkouts, protests, May Day involvement, that the classroom instruction periods, the actual time in which they're getting classroom instruction, are beginning to be winnowed. And that doesn't account for the fact that you've got still some of these radical ideologies, whether it's critical race theory, critical gender theory, Marxism, revisionist history, even leaving that aside, just the specific hours in the day that kids are present, we are now seeing winnowed in greater measure as the activist unions are fomenting this unrest in American classroom education. Any organization that uses students, young people, as the front of its organization is not doing so organically. Teachers who are using their classrooms as bully pulpits are inculcating values that these teachers are hoping are going to be promulgated in the voting booth in the future. And isn't that where we see American public education going right now? If we're not educating for numeracy and literacy rate, and our NAEP scores demonstrate that precise fact, then what we're doing is we are actually educating for activism. And these May Day protests, the walkouts, are just part and parcel of the bigger problem from the unions as a whole.
So much to talk about with the unions. I'd like to move on from the work of the organization that you work for, Defending Education. And I'd like to hear from you, Sarah Parshall Perry, your take on a few things. I'm going to take advantage of the fact that you are a well-known, very fast thinker and very fast talker. And we're trying something new at the Freedom to Learn podcast and having a rapid fire round. So a few questions for you. Which justice will be the next to retire?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. You know, a lot of people have speculated it'll be Alito or Thomas because they are the two oldest judges on the bench right now. But I will tell you, Alito has a full slate of clerks for next year, and both he and Thomas have said they are not going to retire. I have to tell you, I think Alito is waiting to take one of these gender secrecy cases. That is what my heart of hearts tells me. He has issued 2 dissenting opinions already in denials of cert from other ones. I think he's going to weigh it out. If there is one to retire, I'm going to say it's probably going to be Thomas, although Sotomayor, she will probably be the next one to consider. She's had some health issues. So I have to tell you, it's a toss-up between Thomas and Sotomayor, but I don't think Sotomayor is going to want to leave a Ginsburg situation essentially to chance, and she's probably going to want to wait until the administration changes hands.
Okay, which U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals has changed the most since Trump was first elected in 2016?
I would say for the better, it's the Ninth Circuit. For the worse, it's the Fourth Circuit. In fact, the Fourth Circuit was actually overturned statistically more often in the past 2 terms than any other appellate circuit. In fact, it was, of course, the circuit that gave us West Virginia versus EPA, where the Supreme Court overturned the Fourth Circuit and struck down Chevron deference. It also gave us Mahmoud versus Taylor, the interference with the religious rights of parents to direct their children's upbringing and opt their children out of sexualized curriculum, also overturning the Fourth Circuit. I could go on, but the Fourth Circuit is worse and the Ninth Circuit is better. So I guess the coasts are a little more balanced than they were before.
Okay, I'm going to just go ahead and admit that some of these questions are coming from our legal team and not from me, but I'm super curious about your answer, Sarah. So here we go. If the Democrats take the House, the Senate, and the presidency in the 2028 elections, will they pack the Supreme Court?
Oh, they will definitely try. And I will tell you that if there is any right-thinking person listening to this podcast, and I hope there are many of them, that should be an effort that should be stonewalled, stopped, halted at any cost necessary. In fact, Ruth Bader Ginsburg herself said 9 is the number that we've been dealing with. It has been the number that is something we've recognized for time immemorial. It doesn't actually say in the Constitution itself how many justices need to serve on the Supreme Court, but 9 has presented a balance. The last time there was an effort to pack the court was during FDR's presidency. He was very progressive, obviously. He was pushing through his New Deal agenda. I think we're going to see another effort to pack the Supreme Court again, and it should be refused and stopped at all costs.
Another Just slightly controversial question. Should the Senate filibuster be abolished?
I think the Senate filibuster is a necessary check on power. I think it always has been for both the Republicans and the Democrats. It has worked well for many generations. I think it's something that has preserved our constitutional democracy, given us the opportunity for open debate, given us an opportunity for the Senate to be the upper chamber that is more reserved, it is more thoughtful, it will take a longer period of time. There's a necessary higher bar to get things achieved in the Senate. The filibuster is part of that. I don't think demolishing it will do either Republicans or the Democrats any good in the long run.
3 quick questions just to get to know you. Free con or not con?
Oh my gosh. I would say free con.
Okay, I know the answer to this one, actually. Cats or dogs?
Dogs. But I have 2 cats only because I am just now at my pet limit for where I am living. And so ultimately in time, it will be dogs, but I love them
Okay, I didn't
both.
know that. I just knew that you had cats. All right, last one, Sarah. Mountains or beach?
Beach, 100%. Took my kids to Puerto Rico, their first time off the United States mainland for spring break. Had a wonderful time. Always the beach if I can get near water.
I also went to the beach for spring break. Can't wait for my summer beach vacation. Love the beach so much. Last question that we typically ask our Freedom to Learn guests, it's to tackle the myth that bothers you the most. Often that's about education freedom. What myth would you want to tackle?
Oh, wow. That dismantling the Department of Education is actually going to be worse for the cause of education. We actually saw higher progress scores, higher literacy rates, higher numeracy rates before the Department of Education opened its doors, which shows you that throwing money at the problem has never been the better solution for American education. The Department of Education doesn't educate a single kid. It doesn't do anything. It literally simply enforces civil rights law and decides it's going to open or close the purse strings. Those are functions that can actually be better handled by other agencies. And remember, the Department of Education was actually previously the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, meaning it was a precursor to HHS, which means that a lot of those laws can be enforced by the Civil Rights Office at HHS or Department of Justice. So Department of Ed needs to ultimately go. Whether or not we'll see that in our lifetime remains to be seen.
I enjoy following you on social media. How can other people follow your work?
I'm very active, probably too active for my own good, on Twitter. So you can follow me on X at Sarah P. Perry. And of course, our website, defendinged.org. Our tip line is one of my favorite tools. We get probably 50 a day from parents all across the country. Every one of them is vetted. Every one of them is responded to. And we just encourage listeners to go there if they think something might be amiss in their public education system.
Well, Sarah, thank you for your commitment to defending parental rights and civil rights and common sense education policy. And thank you for joining Freedom to Learn.
Thank you for having me, Jenny.
Freedom to Learn is a production of the Defense of Freedom Institute. Learn more about our work at dfipolicy.org. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Send feedback, questions, and episode ideas to podcast@dfipolicy.org. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, please follow and review Freedom to Learn on your favorite podcast app and share it with a friend.